The first thing they told you when you were assigned to a Velkari royal household was that you would never touch the queen. Not a rule they bothered to write down, rules that obvious didn't need writing. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the way the senior staff moved around her, the careful orbits, the precise distances maintained like something sacred or something radioactive, the full 2 body lengths of open air kept between any servant and the royal person at all times. Kale had absorbed it within his first week. The queen of the Velkari did not get touched by anyone for any reason. He thought about that now, standing in the cold service corridor outside the royal kitchens, with the smell of something wrong climbing up the back of his throat and his heart doing something uneven in his chest. And he thought, there are going to be exceptions to that rule tonight. His name was Kale Morrow, and he was 26 years old, and he had been a royal taster for 11 months. Before that, he'd been a line cook in the Integration Authority's transit cafeteria on Meridian Station, which was not a glamorous job but had taught him, in 2 years of standing over industrial prep stations, how food was supposed to smell. His nose was the reason the Integration Authority recruiter had flagged him. His nose was the reason he was here. The Velkari hired humans as tasters because of a biological accident that nobody had planned, and everyone now depended on. The human digestive system responded to certain compounds that were odorless and invisible to Velkari physiology with a fast, distinctive, completely unmistakable reaction. Elevated heart rate, flushed skin, a specific burning taste at the back of the palate that experienced tasters learned to classify with chemical precision. You couldn't fake it. You couldn't train it out. And crucially, the thing that made the whole arrangement work, you couldn't replicate it with any scanner the Velkari had ever built. They had tried. For 200 years they had tried. Sensors that could detect compounds at 1 part per billion in water. Mass spectrometers fast enough to analyze a full dish in under 3 seconds. Algorithmic systems trained on 10,000 cataloged poisons. All of it, across 4 centuries of political assassination, had been beaten eventually. The sensor got fooled. The spectrometer got spoofed. The algorithm encountered a compound it hadn't been trained on. The human stomach, for reasons that xenobiologists still argued about in underfunded university departments across 3 systems, did not get fooled, did not get spoofed, had so far encountered nothing it couldn't identify. This was Kale's value to the crown. He was a stomach. He had made peace with this. He was good at making peace with things that couldn't be changed, which was probably why he'd lasted 11 months when the average taster tenure was 8. Some people found the work humiliating. He found it specific. He had a talent, and the talent was useful, and someone important needed it. He'd grown up in circumstances where that combination was rare enough to treat as a gift. He checked his biometric cuff. The 3rd course had cleared. The 4th was sitting on the service table 20 feet ahead of him. A deep dish preparation of Velkari grain with the dried herb garnished the queen favored on festival evenings, sealed in its carrier, waiting for him to taste and sign off. He walked toward it, and the smell hit him at 10 feet. Not the dish, he knew the dish. He'd tasted it 14 times in 11 months. Knew exactly how it smelled, warm and starchy, the herbs carrying a faint green-sharp note, the broth beneath carrying the mineral depth of the filtration process the royal kitchen used. That smell was fine. That smell was correct. The smell underneath it was not. He stopped walking, breathed, counted 8 counts the way they drilled in the Integration Authority's certification program, which existed to make tasters slow down before they reacted, because the instinct was always to react immediately, and the instinct was often wrong. 8 counts. Not wrong this time. He knew this smell. He had encountered it once before, in his 2nd month, in a routine tasting that had turned out to be the contaminated by accident batch that had gotten the assistant prep cook reassigned. It was a compound called velharite tetraxide in the Velkari chemical classification, a processing byproduct of certain industrial cleaning agents, odorless to Velkari senses, thoroughly invisible to standard kitchen scanners. In humans, it produced nausea, heat flush, heart rate spike, and within about 40 seconds, a near irresistible need to vomit. In Velkari, it produced cardiovascular failure within 5 minutes. It was not a sophisticated poison. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be the kind of thing that cleared every screening and sat quietly in a dish until it reached its target. The thing Kale couldn't immediately resolve was where it was coming from. It didn't smell like the dish itself. The carrier was sealed, and the smell was diffuse in the wrong way, spreading from the table's surface rather than concentrating from a point source the way it would if the contamination was in the food, which meant it was in the carrier housing itself, in the container. Meaning it had been introduced before the kitchen, at some point in the fabrication and delivery chain, and it was probably designed to release into the food via heat transfer when the carrier was opened at serving temperature. He stood very still for 1 full second. The fourth course, the Queen's dinner. Festival evening, which meant the full court in attendance, which meant the serving sequence was timed to the precise minute, which meant the fourth carrier would be in the dining chamber in under 2 minutes if he didn't do something about it right now. His protocol as a taster was clear. Trigger the alert code, step back from the contamination site, secure the area, wait for the security team. Do not intervene. Do not attempt to handle the threat. You are a detector. You are not a responder. You are the instrument that finds the thing. Other people are the instruments that deal with it. He pressed the alert code on his cuff, 3 short. 1 long, 2 short, chemical contamination detected. And then he picked up the carrier and walked to the disposal alcove at the end of the corridor, because the alert code took 90 seconds to process and route to the security team, and 2 minutes was less than 90 seconds. And some math was simple enough that you didn't need to be clever to do it. He sealed the contaminated carrier in the disposal alcove and activated the vent sequence, and then he leaned against the wall and let his hands shake for a moment. Because that was what they were going to do, and he might as well let them do it quickly before the security team arrived. They arrived in 87 seconds. He knew because he counted. The senior security officer was a Velkari named Vorsen, who was large and methodical, and had the particular quality of stillness that Kale had come to associate with Velkari, who had been doing dangerous work for a very long time. Vorsen looked at the sealed alcove. He looked at Kale. He asked, in formal Velkari that Kale could follow at about 70% comprehension, for a precise accounting of what had happened. Kale gave it. Vorsen listened without interrupting. The security team moved around them, taking readings, pulling the carrier logs. After Kale finished, Vorsen was quiet for a moment. "You deviated from protocol," he said. "Yes," Kale said. "You were not authorized to handle the contaminated item." "No." Another silence. Vorsen looked at the alcove again. "The fourth course would have reached the chamber in approximately 110 seconds from the time you detected the compound. The security response time is 90 seconds from alert trigger." He paused. "The gap is 20 seconds. "I know. You acted because of the gap." "I acted because the math was wrong," Kale said. "The protocol assumes the security response beats the serving sequence. Tonight it wouldn't have." Vorsen looked at him with the flat, assessing expression of someone deciding what weight to assign a thing. "We will need a full debrief," he said. "Tonight, before the festival concludes." "I'll be here." "The 5th carrier has been flagged, and the 7th. We are running full spectrum analysis on all remaining courses." He turned to one of his team and issued a rapid order. Kale caught only fragments of manifests, fabrication records, the outer delivery chain. Then he turned back. "The Queen will be informed. Her household will want to speak with you." Kale looked at him. "Her household or her?" Vorsen paused in a way that meant something. "Her," he said. In 11 months, Kale had been to the throne antechamber twice. Both times for formal commendations, standing in dress uniform at the end of the long floor while the full court watched, and a deputy official read out the record of each contamination event in the clipped formal language the court used for everything, including things that had nearly been catastrophic. Both times it had felt less like being recognized and more like being audited. He had received medals and nodded and thought about nothing in particular while it happened. This was not that. The Queen's private study was not a throne room. It was not designed to make you feel small. It was a room with stone walls and a low ceiling and bioluminescent panels set to the blue-green evening tone the Velkhari favored in their personal hours, and it contained a desk covered in actual physical documents, printed on something thin and iridescent, Velkhari data material, and 2 chairs built for Velkhari proportions, and 1 chair that had clearly been brought in specifically for tonight. He sat in it, he waited. He had been told by Vorson on the walk over, "She will speak first, let her speak first, answer directly, and do not be alarmed because she does not conduct these audiences the way she conducts official ones." He had found this advice difficult to apply practically, because he didn't know what alarming would look like in this context, and the not knowing was itself alarming. But he sat in the chair and he breathed through it, and after a few minutes the side door opened and the Queen came in. He had seen her many times, from a distance from below, from the careful 2-body-length remove that the palace kept between her and every servant. He had seen her in portraits and formal regalia, and the ceremonial scales polish that the court required on official occasions. He had never been in a room with her that contained only her and him, and the low blue-green light. She was older than the portraits. Not old, the Velkhari aged differently than humans, slower in the middle spans, faster at the ends, but she carried the specific quality of someone who had been making large decisions for a long time and had learned to hold the weight of them without letting the weight show. Her scales were the natural matte gray-blue of a Velkhari at rest, no ceremony polish, and she was wearing a plain house robe, and she walked to her chair the way someone moved in a room that was actually theirs. She sat, she looked at him. "You are the taster," she said. Her Velkhari was slower and cleaner than anyone else's he'd heard in the palace. "Yes, Excellency." "Kale Morrow, 11 months. 11 months and 3 days. She looked at him a moment longer. "You went past the protocol tonight." "Yes." "Tell me why." She said it like someone who already knew the answer and wanted to hear how he described it. He thought about the carrier and the smell and the 80 seconds and the math. He thought about standing in the corridor with his hands shaking against the wall. He thought about the 2-body-length rule, which he'd been obeying for 11 months, which had felt absolute until the moment it wasn't. "Because I'd tasted every dish that ever reached your table," he said. "For 11 months, your food is mine before it's yours. That's the job. Everything that crosses that threshold, I've already passed it. And I hadn't passed that carrier." He paused. "I wasn't going to let something I hadn't passed reach you." The room was very quiet. The bioluminescent panels breathed their slow blue-green. "This is a personal standard," she said, "not the authority's standard." "It's mine," he said. "The authority's standard is a protocol. The protocol had a gap. Mine didn't." She was still for a long moment in the way the Velkhari were still when they were genuinely processing something, not performing consideration but actually computing it. Then she stood, which he hadn't expected, and she crossed the distance between their chairs, unhurried, deliberate, and she placed her left hand against his face. He knew, from the orientation materials the integration authority gave every palace placement, that the Velkhari secondary left hand was a formal gesture. That placing it against a person's face was used between family members, between a senior and someone being elevated, between equals acknowledging each other as such. He knew it in the abstract the way you knew a word in a language you were still learning. You understood what the dictionary said, and you waited to understand what it actually meant until you felt it. Her hand was cold. Velkari body temperature ran about 4 degrees below human baseline, and he felt the difference, the dry cool of her palm against his jaw, and she held it there for a moment that crossed from gesture into something else. Not performance. Not ceremony. The specific quality of a person communicating something they didn't have a protocol for. Then she stepped back. She said clearly, "You are not a stomach, I want that known." His throat did something that he had to breathe through. He breathed through it. "Thank you, Excellency." "Your contract will be reviewed," she said, settling back into her chair with the efficiency of someone returning to work that had been temporarily interrupted. "The terms will change significantly. You will also attend morning briefings, initially as an observer. Vorson has recommended this." She glanced at her documents. "He does not usually recommend things." "I know," Kale said, because 11 months had taught him that Vorson was a person of extraordinary professional economy, and that everything he said was load-bearing. "He thinks you notice things," the Queen said. "He thinks you noticed the communications disruption 3 weeks ago, before it was flagged." Kale paused. He had noticed something 3 weeks ago, a pattern in the palace's internal messaging latency that had seemed off to him, a delay that didn't match the maintenance schedule, something he'd filed in the back of his mind as something to ask about if it persisted. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't known if it was his place to say anything. "I noticed a latency issue," he said carefully. "I didn't know what it was." "And you said nothing." "I didn't know if," he stopped. "I wasn't sure what I was authorized to notice." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, very slightly, into a register he didn't have a word for yet. "That," she said, "is something we will correct." The investigation took 9 weeks. Kale sat in on parts of it, the Intelligence Authority debrief, portions of the security review that Vorson brought him into as an unofficial consultant, long sessions of listening to arguments conducted mostly in the formal Velkari that he was improving in but not yet fully comfortable with. He kept notes. He kept them in his personal files, in a private log that had started as a tasting record and had expanded over 11 months into something closer to a field journal. He wrote down things he noticed. He wrote down things he didn't understand yet. He wrote down questions. The contamination chain, when it was finally fully traced, went back further than anyone had initially assumed. The carrier had been compromised at the fabrication facility, not the kitchen, not the delivery chain, but the point of manufacture, 3 months before the festival, by someone with access to the production floor during a routine maintenance cycle. That same facility, the investigation found, had processed delivery equipment for 9 of the Empire's 17 regional palaces. The breadth of access implied either a very well-placed individual or a coordinated operation with multiple points of entry. The communications disruption, which had been running quietly for 2 months before Kale noticed the latency artifact, had originated from the same network of access points. When Vorson explained this to him in a direct, brief meeting 3 days into the investigation, Kale was quiet for a long time. "The carrier," he said finally, "it wasn't the primary objective." "No," Vorson said. "It was supposed to be found, supposed to redirect us toward the kitchens. So that we looked there, and not at the communications infrastructure." Vorson looked at him. "They built the operation around the assumption of how a taster would respond to finding contamination. They knew the protocol. They calculated the response chain." Kale sat with this. "They calculated me. They calculated what they thought you were." "What they thought I was," he repeated. "An instrument," Vorson said. "A detector with a defined response pattern. Find contamination, trigger alert, secure site, wait for security. Predictable, containable. They built around it." Kale was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. "And because I didn't follow the protocol." The gap in their calculation opened. Instead of the kitchen chain receiving full security attention for weeks while the communications disruption continued, The carrier was isolated in under 2 minutes. The alert went through a non-standard route. And Vorson, he paused with a dry precision. I noticed the anomaly of a taster not waiting for the security team before I noticed anything else, which caused me to look more carefully at the full event chain, which led, eventually, to the communications infrastructure. Kale thought about this for a long time after Vorson left. He sat in the small room Vorson had given him for the debrief sessions, a plain stone room with a desk and a terminal and a window that looked onto one of the inner courtyards, and he thought about what it meant to be calculated. They had known about the taster program, had understood what a taster was built to do, had constructed an entire deception around the assumption that a taster would behave like a taster, would find the thing, would follow the steps, would stay in the lane the protocol had laid out, had counted on it, had needed it. He had not counted on himself doing anything else. He was not, in the moment, doing anything strategic or clever or intentional. He was doing the thing that felt true in the gap where the protocol ran out. This is mine. It doesn't pass. I don't let it pass. That was all. But that thing, that specific, stubborn, impractical, entirely unremarkable thing, was the thing they hadn't calculated. Not because they had missed something sophisticated, because it wasn't sophisticated. It was just a person doing what felt right when the instructions ran out. He wrote this in his journal. He wrote it in plain language, without drama, the way he wrote everything. He was not sure it was wisdom. He was not sure it was anything more than a description of one specific night in a service corridor. But he wrote it down because he had learned, growing up on Meridian Station in the kind of household that didn't have a lot of room for abstraction, that the only way to know if you understood something was to say it clearly. He had been calculated as an instrument. He had not behaved like one. This had mattered. He was trying to understand why, precisely, in a way he could apply to whatever came next. The morning briefings started 2 weeks after the investigation opened. He came to the first one not knowing what to expect and sat in the back in a chair that was slightly too small for Velkari proportions and slightly too large for optimal human ergonomics, and spent 90 minutes following, at roughly 65% comprehension, a wide-ranging discussion of regional administrative matters in the outer systems that touched on resource allocation disputes, a pending diplomatic review cycle, and a technical infrastructure audit. He said nothing, he listened, he wrote in his journal. The second briefing he followed at 70%, the third 74%. He was tracking his comprehension the way he'd once tracked his palate sensitivity during certification training, specific, systematic, writing down where he was so he'd know how far he'd come. His mother had run the cargo manifests for a mid-sized shipping cooperative on Meridian Station for 18 years, and she had kept a personal ledger that was separate from the official records, her own accounting of where things stood, because she had said once, "The official records tell you what the system thinks is true. Your own records tell you what's actually true." He had inherited this habit without understanding its value until he was far enough from home to need it. At the fifth briefing, a senior advisor named Velor presented a regional security assessment that contained a reference to a logistics irregularity in the outer supply chain. The irregularity was flagged as minor. It was described in one sentence and then moved past. Kale wrote it down. After the briefing, he went back to his room and pulled the relevant sector logs from the public administrative database. He had terminal access now, general level, sufficient for cross-referencing, and spent 2 hours reading, and by the end of the 2 hours he had a strong suspicion that the irregularity Velor had described in one sentence as minor was not minor. It had the same signature as the latency anomaly he'd noticed 3 weeks before the festival. Not identical, not obviously the same source, but the same quality, a thing that was slightly wrong in a way that didn't call attention to itself, designed to sit quietly in the margin of the records until it was needed. He didn't go to Vorson immediately. He went to Vorson's assistant, who was a young Velkari named Ketri, whom he'd been having careful, incremental conversations with across the past 3 weeks as part of the entirely unofficial language exchange arrangement that the Integration Authority liaison, a veteran named Tesserin who had been at the palace for 13 years, and who ran a weekly gathering for the human staff that was partly cultural maintenance and mostly people eating food that tasted like food and laughing at the same things, had suggested as a good way to improve his formal register comprehension. He told Ketri he had noticed something. He described what he'd found. He asked if Ketri thought this was worth bringing to Vorsen directly. Ketri looked at his notes for a long moment, then looked at him. Then said, in the careful formal Velkari of someone choosing their words with precision, Vorsen would want to know this, immediately. He went to Vorsen. Vorsen listened to the full account without expression, asked 2 clarifying questions, looked at the sector log cross-references, was quiet for 11 seconds, which Kale counted because 11 seconds of Vorsen being quiet was long enough to be meaningful. "You found this in the public database," Vorsen said. "The administrative database, general access level. And you recognized it because it looked like the other one, the same quality of wrongness." He paused. "I don't know if that's useful. I don't know if I'm right." "You have been right about the quality of wrongness twice now," Vorsen said. He stood, which meant the meeting was ending. "This will be investigated. You will be contacted if your input is needed." A pause. "You will also receive an upgrade to your terminal access, Administrative Plus, effective today." Kale walked back to his room through the cool stone corridors of the palace, and the bioluminescent panels were in their afternoon cycle. The warm amber tone the Velkari preferred between the 2nd and 4th service hours, and the corridor smelled of the palace, stone and copper, and the faint wax resin of the formal regalia that someone in the household staff was treating somewhere nearby. He had stopped noticing the smell of the palace as alien about 6 months ago. Now he noticed it the way he noticed the smell of Meridian Station's recycled air when he thought about it deliberately, as a specific place, with its own specific character, that he knew well enough to read. He was thinking about this, about knowing a place, about the particular intimacy of knowing something through your nose, when he rounded the corner into the administrative wing and found a small Velkari woman standing outside his door holding a container. Her name was Res, and she cleaned the administrative wing, and she was approximately, Kale estimated, Velkari aging being difficult to read for humans, somewhere in her late adolescence. She had been cleaning this wing for the full 11 months he'd been at the palace, and they had never spoken beyond a brief exchanged greeting, because the palace had a clear, informal hierarchy of whose time it was permissible to take, and a cleaner's time was not typically taken by a mid-level taster. She was holding the container with both hands and looking at him with the expression of someone who had been working up to something, and had arrived at the moment of having to follow through. "For you," she said, in colloquial Velkari, which was faster and contracted differently than the formal register, and which he could follow at about 50%, but that sentence was simple enough that even at 50% he got it fully. He took the container, opened it. Inside, pressed into a flat disc, was a traditional Velkari festival sweet, the kind made with the same grain as the royal evening service, densely textured, flavored with Velkari cane flour. He knew from the Integration Authority's cultural materials that giving this specific sweet after a festival was an old Velkari custom. It was what you made for people who had protected your household. He looked at the container, he looked at Res. "Thank you," he said, in colloquial Velkari. He'd been drilling the colloquial register specifically with Tesserin for 3 weeks, because the formal register was improving steadily, but the colloquial was where people actually lived. Res made the brief, compressed sound that he had learned was the Velkari version of someone trying not to look pleased. She said, "Your accent is better." I'm working on it. She looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention the Velkari gave to things they were deciding whether to say. Then she said, "There is a word. The older staff use it, for people who go back. Go back. When something is difficult, when it would be easier to stop, they go back anyway." She paused. "There is a word for this." He asked her to say it. She did, 6 syllables, 2 of which he couldn't replicate immediately. He spent the next 3 days drilling them with Tesserin until he could say the whole word without stumbling, and Tesserin told him what it meant. A single Velkari concept that folded together the ideas of stubbornness, commitment, and a specific quality of refusing to accept that a thing is finished when it isn't. And he wrote it in his journal in both Velkari script and phonetic transliteration. He thought about his mother, not with sadness or not only with the specific feeling of recognizing something across a distance. She had worked cargo manifests for 18 years and kept her own ledger and fixed the same class of problem in the same class of system on Meridian Station for nearly 2 decades, and nobody had a word for it, not a single word, and here 40 light-years away there was a 6-syllable Velkari term for exactly the quality she'd had, for the thing she'd given him without naming it. He kept the container on his desk. When Ress came to clean the wing, they talked briefly in the colloquial register, and his percentage climbed week by week. At the 8-week mark, he was tracking formal register at 82% and colloquial at 63%, and he was writing both numbers in his journal and watching them move. The sector log irregularity resolved 3 weeks after Vorsen pulled it. It was not, in the end, connected to the festival contamination chain. It was a separate operation, a different actor, possibly opportunistic rather than coordinated, possibly simply an administrative anomaly that had been allowed to compound over time. The investigation was ongoing. Cale's input was requested twice more. Both times he provided it clearly and withdrew cleanly, without pushing for more access or more information than he was given. He was learning the court through its information the way he had learned the palace through its smells. Carefully, specifically, building a map that was made of what he actually knew rather than what he assumed. There was a state dinner in the 7th week of the investigation. It was for a diplomatic delegation from the Keth Confederation, one of the Empire's oldest external relationships, complicated in the way that very old relationships between unequal parties were always complicated, full of history that neither side fully acknowledged but both sides fully felt. Cale served as part of the tasting team, which was larger for state dinners, a 3-person rotation across 10 courses, and spent 7 hours in a state of maintained alertness that left him, by the end, running on the particular hollow-headed energy of someone whose body has been at emergency readiness for too long. He was filling out the post-event log when Vorsen appeared at his station. "Clean?" Vorsen asked. "All 10 courses, all 3 intervals." Vorsen was quiet for a moment. "You observed the delegation." "I was there," Cale said carefully. "You observed the lead Keth diplomat," Vorsen said. "Not a question." Cale had. The lead diplomat was a Keth elder. The Keth ran older than most species, the very senior ones crossing into what humans would call extreme age, with the deep indigo-brown coloring of an elder Keth in formal status dress. He had watched this diplomat across the evening with the attention he gave to everything in these briefing-adjacent contexts, and he had noticed something in the way the diplomat looked at the Queen across the state table. Not hostility, not warmth. Something more complicated and older than either. "There's an expression," Cale said. He had it when he looked at her. "I don't have a word for it." Vorsen looked at him with the flat assessment that meant something was being weighed. The Velkari word is Velsanthari. The Keth have their own equivalent. It means, approximately, the look you give to something you once had a claim to and no longer do, not with anger, with the knowledge that the thing is gone. Cale considered this, the history between the Confederation and the Empire. The history is long, Vorson said. The queen holds this dinner once each cycle. The diplomat attends. 8 courses. They ask about each other's families. A pause. This is governance. It is not simple. But she does it. She does it because the alternative compounds over time into something worse. He looked at Kale. You have a similar quality, I think. The not compounding, the going back. Kale thought about the carrier and the 88 seconds, about the latency anomaly and the sector log, about the slow climb of comprehension percentages in his journal. I just do the next thing, he said. Yes, Vorson said. In this court, the doing of the next thing is not as common as it should be. He picked up his administrative tablet. Your terminal access has been upgraded again. You will receive formal confirmation in the morning. He paused. Administrative and Security Advisory, Level 2. Kale said nothing for a moment. Then, that's not a taster's clearance level. No, Vorson said. It is not. After Vorson left, Kale stayed at his station for a while, in the cooling quiet of the post-dinner hall. The serving staff moved through post-event routines around him, the bioluminescent panels shifting toward their night cycle, the enormous dining space returning to the particular emptiness of a place designed for occupancy and temporarily vacated. The remnants of the state dinner, the careful choreography of 10 courses, the diplomatic performances, the ancient grief in a diplomat's expression across an official table, were being dismantled methodically into administrative record. He thought about the word Res had given him, the 6-syllable Velkari concept for going back when it would be easier to stop. He thought about his mother's ledger and his father's habit of arriving early for every shift, not because anyone had asked him to, but because arriving early was what you did when the work mattered, and the work always mattered if you let it. He thought about Meridian Station's recycled air and the transit cafeteria, and 2 years of prep work that had built a nose sensitive enough to catch a poison in the gap between a delivery carrier's housing and its contents. He thought about the Queen's hand, cold against his face, and the specific quality of being told you are not an instrument by someone who had the authority to define what you were. He was not sure what he was instead. He was still building the map. He had, so far, a journal at 43 pages. A formal register comprehension of 82%, a colloquial comprehension of 63% and climbing, an administrative plus security advisory level 2 terminal access, a container of festival sweets on his desk, a word that meant going back when it would be easier to stop. The map was incomplete. It was, he had come to understand, the kind of map that would always be incomplete, because the territory kept growing, because the court was not a fixed thing but a living one, 40,000 years old and still changing, and the only honest map of it was one you updated every day. He was fine with this. He had grown up on Meridian Station and learned to update things constantly, because stations were systems and systems required constant maintenance, and nothing that wasn't being maintained was actually working even if it looked like it was. Closed his log. He stood. He walked out through the night cycle of the palace, past the cooled stone and the mineral smell and the ambergonta blue of the bioluminescent panels in their overnight tone, and he was already thinking about the morning briefing. There was a regional security assessment on the agenda, Velor's quarterly review, and he had 3 questions he'd been holding for the right moment, and he wanted to check the outer system logistics data before he asked them so he could ask them precisely. That was the work. Not the heroics. The heroics had lasted about 2 minutes and 40 seconds, including the wall leaning and the hand shaking. The work was the briefings and the journal and the percentages climbing, and the careful, patient, daily accumulation of knowing a place well enough to read it the way you read the air of a kitchen you'd worked in for years. He passed through the outer corridor, where the service entrance opened onto the inner courtyard, and the night air of the courtyard reached him. The palace ran its outdoor temperature controls looser at night, and the air carried the living smell of the plants in the courtyard beds, something green mineral that had no meridian station equivalent, something he'd been smelling for 11 months and only recently started noticing as something he liked. He stopped for a moment, not for long, just long enough to breathe it. He thought about the Queen asking him to attend the morning briefings, about the note from Vorson about security advisory clearance, about Res and the festival suite and the 6-syllable word that meant stubbornness as a value. He thought about the moment in the corridor when the protocol had run out and something else had moved his feet back toward the carrier, something pre-verbal, something that came from people who'd worked cargo manifests and atmospheric maintenance for decades without fanfare, something that said, "This is mine to fix and I fix it." He had been built for this, he thought, by people who didn't know they were building him for anything specific. They were building him for Meridian Station, for a life of keeping systems running, for the honest, invisible maintenance of things that needed maintaining. They could not have known that the same quality, the same particular, mundane, unspectacular stubbornness would matter here, in a 40,000-year-old alien palace, in the gap between a carrying container and a queen's table. But it did. It mattered exactly as much here as it would have mattered there. And that felt, in a way he would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who hadn't already understood it, like the most important thing he'd learned in 11 months. The courtyard smelled of living things. The palace breathed around him, vast and specific and strange and his. He went inside. He had work in the morning. He went to do it. The morning briefing on the 42nd day, after the festival, was the first one in which Cale asked a question out loud. He had been preparing for it for 4 days. Not performing preparation, genuinely preparing, the way you prepared for something you knew mattered and didn't want to get wrong. He had the sector log data cross-referenced, a specific discrepancy flagged in his personal notes, a clear and bounded question that was precise enough to demonstrate he'd done the background work and open enough to invite the kind of answer that moved a conversation forward rather than closing it. He waited for the right moment, after Velor finished the outer systems summary, in the natural pause before the next agenda item, and he asked it. Informal Velkari. 82% of his own construction. The remainder borrowed from a construction Tesserin had drilled with him specifically for the phrasing he needed. The room went slightly still, not alarmed, more the quality of stillness that came from something unexpected happening in a space where expected things happened. 7 senior advisors and 3 administrative staff in Vorson, all orienting toward the human in the back row chair who had spoken. Velor looked at him. The look was not unfriendly. It was the specific look of someone who had just been asked a sharp question and was deciding how sharp to be in return. Your comprehension of the outer system's logistics framework has improved significantly, he said. I've been reading the background files, Cale said. The question stands. Another pause. Velor answered the question. It was a real answer, specific, direct, without the redirections that characterized answers given to people whose questions you didn't consider load-bearing. After the briefing, 2 of the advisors passed by his back row chair on the way out. The first said nothing, but made the brief secondary eye contact that in Velkari's social register meant acknowledged. The second stopped and said, in colloquial Velkari fast enough that he caught maybe 70% of it, something that he parsed on reflection as, "You've been reading further than the summary files." He had. He'd been reading for 2 months, every evening, pulling the administrative records at his access level, and following threads the way you followed a smell, one thing leading to the next, staying with it until you understood it or proved it wasn't there. He wrote about this in his journal that evening, not the specifics of what he'd read, those belonged in the administrative files, but the texture of the work, what it felt like to learn a place in this way, from the inside of its information rather than the outside of its meals. He wrote about the difference between being an instrument and being a person doing work, and he wrote it plainly, without drama, the way you wrote things when you were trying to understand them rather than impress anyone. He had been writing the journal for 11 months. It was 61 pages now. The first 20 pages were tasting logs, dish names, compounds detected, reaction notes, timestamps. Then the contamination event notes. Then the briefing notes. Then the language tracking. Then the entries that were harder to categorize. Observations about the court, about the Velkari he was slowly learning to know as people rather than as species members, about the way the empire worked from the inside versus how it looked from the outside. He had been born on a transit hub. He had grown up in a place defined by people moving through it on their way somewhere else. He had never lived anywhere that had roots, the kind of deep old roots the Velkari Palace had, 40,000 years of decisions accumulated into the walls, the protocols, the specific way the bioluminescent panels cycled from amber through blue-green to the night tone. He had not known, before coming here, what it felt like to be inside something ancient, to be a new thing in a very old place. He was learning. It was slow and specific and made demands on him that the tasting certification program had never mentioned. He was, on the whole, grateful for the demands. 3 weeks after the question in the briefing, Vorsen brought him into a closed session. It was a small meeting. Vorsen, 2 senior intelligence staff whose names Kale knew from the briefings but hadn't spoken with directly, and one of the Queen's senior household advisors, a Velkari named Oskith who had been at the palace for longer than anyone Kale could identify, and who carried the specific authority of someone whose institutional memory was itself a form of power. They were looking at the outer system irregularity Kale had flagged 6 weeks ago, and which had been running through the investigation chain since. The irregularity had not resolved into a clean single cause. It had instead opened into something more complex, a pattern of small anomalies, each individually below the threshold for escalation, collectively forming a picture of sustained low-level access to a specific category of administrative data. Supply chain timing, Kale said, when Vorsen laid it out. Yes, Vorsen said. Someone has been reading the supply chain timing data for the Royal Household Service for approximately 4 months, not extracting it, reading it, building a model of the service cycle. The implication sat in the room for a moment. They want to know when the next delivery chain is, Kale said, when the next opportunity is in the fabrication and transport cycle. This is the assessment. Have you shut the access? We have identified the access point. We have not closed it. Kale looked at him. You're watching it. We are watching it, Vorsen confirmed. And we are considering whether the watch would be enhanced by a change to the internal service chain that would be visible to someone monitoring supply timing data. A change that would, if they acted on it, give us a confirming event that closes the identification of the external actor. Kale sat with this. You want to set a table. Vorsen's expression moved slightly into the register that Kale had learned over months of observation meant something between approval and amusement. This is one description. You want me to help design the table, not a question. You have tasted every dish that has reached this household for nearly a year. You understand the service chain in a way that is different from understanding it administratively. You know which anomalies in a delivery sequence would be notable to someone monitoring from outside and which would be invisible. Vorsen looked at him steadily. You are no longer only a taster, but you are still the person who knows the food. Kale thought about this. He thought about the carrier and the smell and the gap in the math, and about how none of that had been intentional, had not been strategy, had been simply the thing you did when the instructions ran out and the wrong thing was about to happen. He thought about being calculated as an instrument and moving outside the calculation by accident, by stubbornness, by the specific human quality of doing the next thing when the protocol ran out. I'll help design the table, he said, on one condition. The room was quiet. Oskith, who had not spoken, looked at him with the particular quality of attention that very senior Velkari gave to unexpected things. "I want to be in the room when we pull it," Kale said, not observing present. Vorson looked at him for 7 seconds. "Level 2 clearance does not." "I know what Level 2 covers," Kale said. "I'm asking for a case exception. This is my table. I said it, I should be there when it's answered." Another silence. Oskith said something very quietly to Vorson, too fast, too low, in a register Kale couldn't follow. Vorson listened, then looked back at Kale. "The request will be put to the Queen's office," he said, "for tonight's briefing." It was approved. He found out from Ketri before the briefing. In the casual way things moved through the palace's informal information channels, faster than the official channels, less documented, and in his experience more accurate. He filed it in his journal without commentary. The numbers could speak for themselves. The table was set over 4 days. Kale worked with Vorson's intelligence staff on the specific parameters. A carefully constructed false service timing adjustment, introduced into the supply chain data in a way that would be visible to whoever was monitoring, plausible enough to act on, time to give the external actor a window they would recognize as an opportunity. On the 5th day, the actor moved. Kale was in the intelligence operations room when the alert triggered. It was not the kind of room that contained drama, no alarms, no visual displays of crisis, just a series of terminals and Vorson's staff, and the specific quality of focused attention that people gave to things that required it. The alert came through as a flagged access event on a specific courier carrier in the outer fabrication chain. Kale looked at the data, he looked at Vorson. "Same signature as the festival carrier," he said. "Yes," Vorson said. "Same fabrication technique, same compound family." He was already issuing instructions to the intercept team. "Different compound," Kale said. Vorson paused, looked back at the data, looked at Kale. "You can read that from the sensor profile." "The sensor profile looks right, but the dispersal model is off by a factor of about 12% from the festival carrier profile. Either they've modified the delivery mechanism or they've changed the compound," Vorson finished. He revised the instructions to the intercept team, adding a full spectrum analysis requirement to the extraction protocol. The compound, when the intercept team extracted and analyzed the carrier, was different. Not Velharite tetracide. Something more sophisticated, less detectable by standard analysis. The kind of compound that would have cleared a scanner that had been updated to catch tetracide and its known analogs. The kind of compound that would have been invisible to any instrument calibrated from the festival event. Kale read the analysis report and thought about instruments. About how instruments were calibrated to catch specific things, and how the people who built the table, the people on the other side of this, wherever they were, had also been watching and updating and recalibrating based on what had been caught before. "They thought we'd updated the scanners," he said. "They updated their compound accordingly," Vorson agreed. "They still didn't update their calculation of the human factor." Vorson looked at him. "They built around the assumption that the scanner had been updated," Kale said. "They didn't build around the assumption that the person would notice the dispersal model discrepancy." He paused. "They still think the human in the chain is a detector calibrated to specific parameters. They don't think the human in the chain reads the data." "Do you intend for this to be remedied?" "I intend," Kale said carefully, "for them to keep not knowing that for as long as possible." Vorson looked at him for a long moment. "This," he said, "is a sophisticated position for someone who was, 11 months ago, a taster." 11 months and 8 weeks, Kale said. Vorson said nothing, but something in his expression settled into a quality that Kale had come to read, over these months of careful observation, as a Velkari's version of satisfied. The interception closed the active threat. The broader investigation was ongoing and would be for some time. The network that had built around the palace service chain was deep and patient, and not the kind of thing that resolved cleanly in a single event. But the immediate capability had been disrupted. The external actor's identity had been substantially narrowed, and the specific vulnerability in the fabrication chain had been patched in a way that couldn't be easily reconstructed from outside. Cale wrote the full sequence in his journal. Not for record, the official records were thorough. For himself, for the map. He was sitting at his desk in the administrative wing on the evening after the interception closed, writing, when the household notification arrived on his terminal. Not from Vorson, from the Queen's office directly. The Queen wished to meet with him, not a formal audience, the same private study, the same blue-green evening panels, at his earliest convenience. He went the next morning. She was at her desk when he arrived, working. She looked up when he came in, and she looked at him for a moment with the same quality of attention she'd given him on the festival night. The full, unhurried consideration of someone who thought about the people they were responsible for. "You set a table," she said. "With Vorson's team, yes. And then you read the dispersal model discrepancy." "I noticed it. Vorson says you saved approximately 3 weeks of additional investigation by noticing it." Cale said nothing. He was not good at accepting this kind of accounting gracefully, and had learned that the Velkhari respected silence in response to it more than deflection. The Queen stood. She came around the desk. She was shorter than him, as she had been the last time, and she moved with the same deliberateness, and she placed her left hand against his face again. The same gesture, the same cold, precise touch, held for the same moment that crossed from form into meaning. But this time she did something else. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead very briefly against his. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was the Velkhari gesture. He knew it from the cultural materials, had seen it between the court's senior advisors in moments of ceremony, had understood it intellectually for recognizing someone as your own. Not a subject, not a servant, not an instrument. "One of yours." He stood very still through it. He breathed. When she stepped back, she said plainly, "Whatever you were when you arrived here, you have become something else. The court knows it. Vorson knows it." A pause. "I want you to know it." He didn't have anything to say that was equal to it, so he said the thing that was true. "I'm still learning the place." "Yes," she said, and there was something in her expression that he would have called a smile if he'd been more confident in his reading of Velkhari expressions, which he was not yet, but was working on. "That is exactly right. You are still learning. This is why you are valuable." She moved back toward her desk. "Vorson's office has a recommendation for your formal title change. It goes to the household review next week." "What does it say?" "Advisory to the royal household, security and intelligence liaison, integration authority." She looked at her documents. "It is not a title that has previously existed." He thought about this. About titles, about instruments, about the specific long road from a transit cafeteria on Meridian Station to a quiet study in a 40,000-year-old palace where a queen had just pressed her forehead to his and said, "One of yours." "That works," he said. He walked back through the palace corridors in the morning amber tone of the bioluminescent panels, past the stone and the copper mineral smell, past the places he knew and the places he was still learning, past the courtyard where the Velkhari junior staff were taking their morning meal, and talking in the colloquial register. He could follow at 71% now, and would follow at 80 by the end of the month because he was tracking it and it was moving. He stopped at his desk. He opened his journal. He wrote the date, the Velkhari calendar date, which he'd been using in his journal for 6 months because it was the time that governed the work, and he wrote a single sentence. "The map is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. This is correct." He closed the journal. He pulled up the morning briefing materials. There was a regional diplomatic review on the agenda, and a logistics audit of the outer systems delivery chain, and a security infrastructure update from Vorsen's office that had gone to general advisory distribution this morning, and that he needed to read before the briefing started in 40 minutes. He had work to do, he went to do it. The palace breathed around him, ancient and specific and alive, and the morning came in through the courtyard window in the particular alien light that he had stopped noticing as alien and had started noticing as morning. And Kale Morrow, who had been a taster, who was becoming something without a clean name, who had gone back for the carrier and had never entirely stopped going back, sat at his desk and read the day's first file. Outside the window, the courtyard plants were doing the thing they did in the mornings, shifting toward the light. He understood the impulse completely. There was one more thing. He thought about it for 2 weeks before he did anything about it, which was not like him. He was not generally a person who sat on things. He did the next thing. But this one required turning over. It was about Res. She came to clean the administrative wing 3 mornings a week, and in the months since the festival suite she had become, in the careful incremental way that relationships built in a place with strict hierarchy built, something that he thought of as a colleague, or as close to it as the court structure allowed. She talked with him in the colloquial register while she worked. She corrected his pronunciation with a directness that would have been jarring from anyone else, and was, from her, simply useful. She had told him things about the palace, not secrets, not intelligence-relevant things, just the texture of the place as experienced from her position in it, that had given him a kind of understanding that no briefing document provided. She knew the palace from the inside of its walls. He knew the palace from the inside of its information. The two kinds of knowing were different in ways that turned out to matter. He had been thinking about this, about how different positions gave different kinds of knowing, about how the map was incomplete not because he hadn't read enough files, but because the map of a living place was always built from multiple kinds of seeing, when he realized that what he was actually thinking about was whether to bring Res's name to Vorsen. Not as a subject of investigation, as a resource. He knew, from 6 months of corridor conversation, and from genuine attention, that Res was extremely intelligent, that she read widely, that she had opinions about court politics that were sometimes sharper than what he heard in briefings, and that she was confined to the cleaning staff not because she was suited to the cleaning staff, but because the Velkari court's path structures were rigid in the way that the paths of very old institutions were rigid. She would clean the administrative wing for years unless something changed. No one would ask her what she thought. No one would bring her observations to a briefing. He thought about this for 2 weeks. He thought about the Queen pressing her forehead to his and saying one of yours. He thought about what that meant, actually meant, as a thing to be responsible for rather than just to receive. He thought about his mother fixing the same ventilation systems for 18 years and being invisibly good at it, and whether her being invisibly good at it had served the station or served the culture that made good work invisible. On the 17th day, he went to Vorsen. He did not oversell it. He presented it plainly. There is a staff member in the administrative wing cleaning rotation who has an unusual quality of observation and an unusual depth of informal understanding of the court's social dynamics, and she is currently positioned where her capabilities are not accessible to the intelligence function, and this seems like a gap. Vorsen listened, asked 2 questions, said he would look into it. 3 weeks later, Res was transferred to the household administrative staff with a training placement in the Intelligence Auxiliary Program. She came to find Kale the morning the transfer was processed. She stood at the door of his office. He had an office now, small, stone-walled, with the courtyard window, and looked at him with the Velkari expression he had finally, definitively learned to identify as a smile. "You did this," she said. "I noticed a gap," he said. "You filled it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in formal Velkari, slow, precise, the register she almost never used with him, which meant it was carrying weight. "The word I gave you, the 6-syllable word. I remember it. It works in 2 directions," she said. "Going back for the difficult thing and going back for the person." She paused. "It means both." He hadn't known that. He went back to his journal that evening and wrote it down. Then he sat for a moment with the courtyard evening outside his window and the palace breathing its ancient specific breath around him, and he thought about all the kinds of going back there were. For the carrier in the corridor. For the sector log anomaly. For the table that caught the second attempt. For the word in the language he was still learning. For the person in the room who the room had been ignoring. All of it the same quality, all of it the same muscle, different applications. The thing his mother had built into him without knowing she was building anything. The thing the Velkari had a word for, and Meridian Station didn't. He was going to spend a long time here, he thought. Not the 6 months he'd signed the first time. Not the 1-year extension he'd signed the second. Something longer. Something that looked less like a posting and more like a life. The slow, specific building of a map that would never be finished because the place kept growing. He was fine with this. He was exactly the kind of person who was fine with this. The kind who didn't need the map finished to keep mapping. Outside, the courtyard went into its evening, the plants settling into their dormant cycle, the junior staff clearing their recreation spaces, the bioluminescent panels beginning the slow shift toward night tone. The palace around him was making all the sounds of a place full of people doing the work that kept it running. He opened the day's last file. He started to read.